Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Outreach Debate PF February topic lecture. My name is Nathan. I'm a junior at Northridge High School. And Alyssa, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Alyssa. I'm a sophomore at Johns Creek High School in Georgia.
Great. So if you came to the last topic lecture, then you already know what's happening. But if not, we're just going to go over the overview of the topic and some basic arguments. So let's get started. Right. So this month's resolution is resolved. The United States should accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Let's go into some background. So the ICC, International Criminal Court, was established in 2002. It's meant to prosecute against war crimes, and it's partnered and established by the UN, and it receives funding from them, but they're more of an independent jurisdiction body. They're not formally under UN jurisdiction. And also, I'll go back in a second. And also, not all ICC members are UN members and vice versa. And onto the Rome Statute. So the Rome Statute is the founding treaty of the ICC. It's made by the UN. It was adopted in 1998, then established the ICC 4 years later, and it defines the ICC's jurisdiction, procedures, etc. So basically, the Rome Statute just says that the ICC exists, and what you do with the Rome Statute, depending on what party you are, defines the jurisdiction you're under. So let's go into that. So onto some definitions. There's signing, there's ratifying, and then there's acceding the Rome Statute. First is signing. So from the official UN website, they define signing as when the signature is subject to ratification, acceptance, or approval, the signature does not establish the consent to be bound. So in summary, what this means is that if you sign the Rome Statute, you acknowledge that the ICC exists, but don't allow them to have jurisdiction over you. In contrast, ratifying is when you indicate its consent to be bound to a treaty. So if you ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC, you're giving the ICC formal jurisdiction over your state and giving up a bit of your sovereignty. And finally, the third term in the resolution is acceding to, right? And it's very simple. Acceding is the exact same thing legally as ratifying. So when the resolution says the United States should accede to the Rome Statute, that just means that we're giving up our sovereignty and allowing the ICC to have jurisdiction over us. All right, so in summary, again, signing means we acknowledge that it exists, and ratifying and acceding means that we actually give up rights to the ICC. In total, 139 countries have signed onto the Rome Statute, and 29 of them have not ratified. So let's talk about them. Some important ratifiers are Ukraine, the UK, Palestine, South Korea, Japan, and Canada. And either some non-ratifiers or non-signers are the US. Although we signed, we haven't given up sovereignty to the ICC. And then the ones that haven't signed the Rome Statute at all are the usual suspects. So Russia, China, North Korea, India, Israel, none of these countries even acknowledge that the ICC exists. All right, let's talk about what the ICC is capable of doing. So the ICC can adjudicate crimes that national governments can't or won't act on themselves. Cases can be brought to the court by treaty members that signed the Rome Statute, the UN Security Council, or the ICC prosecutor themselves. They also must cooperate with the domestic government where the crime occurred. And there's two drawbacks to this. The first is that it's part of the treaty. So the ICC isn't allowed to just barge into a country just because a war crime was committed. You must have cooperation with that domestic government first. Second, this also makes sense because the ICC lacks a formal military, right? So the only way they're able to have manpower is to cooperate with domestic powers. And specifically, the ICC adjudicates 4 different crimes. The first is war crimes, so anything in the Geneva Convention, torture, mutilation, taking hostages and terrorism, etc. Second is genocide, intentionally murdering a certain group, such as the Uyghur Muslim genocide in China, for example. Third is crimes against humanity, so widespread attacks against innocent civilians. An example is the Ukraine conflict with Vladimir Putin. Fourth is crimes of aggression, so armed force violations of a sovereign nation. This one is still under talks in the ICC, And as of now, the ICC lacks the jurisdiction to enforce this crime against individuals. So the top three are all solidified, and the fourth is being added in talks right now. All right, so a brief history of some individuals that the ICC has convicted or indicted. So some detainees that we successfully caught. Dominic Ongwen, crimes in Uganda. The second is Ali Abdel Rahman, war crimes in Sudan, and then two other African leaders. Then there are some people that the ICC still has indicts out for, but are still at large. So like Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, Vladimir Putin for his crimes in Ukraine, Benjamin Netanyahu for Palestine just recently, and Osama Jim, which is another leader in Africa. Really quickly, can anyone unmute and tell me if there's a certain trend along the 8 individuals on screen?
A lot of them are in Africa.
Correct. So
Africa.
Yeah. 6 of the 8 people on screen are from Africa, specifically African war generals or leaders. This is not a coincidence. 47 of the 54 indictments issued by the ICC were against African nations. And this is disproportional because that is not proportional to the global makeup of war crimes. African leaders do not commit all of the war crimes on Earth. It's very disproportional. Because of that, the AU feels very targeted by ICC jurisdiction. And in fact, in 2017, they passed a resolution to leave the ICC, although it didn't formally pass. As of now, only Burundi is the African nation that has left the ICC. Then having a discussion about the ICC's capability. So since 2002, the ICC has only convicted 11 people. Indicting someone and convicting people are different. Indicting someone is like saying that someone has committed a crime. Convicting someone is formally charging them and issuing an arrest warrant for them. What happens is that although there's a lot of warrants, most of the cases just fall through because frankly the ICC lacks formal capability. That's why even though they've had 59 arrest warrants, 30 of them are still at large, and I think of that 59, 11 of them just died. So before they were even able to arrest them, these mainly African war leaders just died. That's why frankly, the ICC right now doesn't really have a lot of soft or formal power, so most leaders don't listen. But they have had some form of deterrence. For example, separatist movements in Africa and some regional conflicts do tend to kill less people under ICC watch because to some extent leaders are wary of being charged with war crimes. But holistically, the ICC has had very little success. Something to keep in mind when you're making uniqueness for cases. Okay, and Alyssa can take the AF arguments.
Yeah, so after that, we'll just get into one of the first AF arguments, which is going to be an increased ICC funding. So this is going to be a pretty standard argument. Your uniqueness would be something along the lines of, oh, the ICC is low on funds right now. And the link is going to be a little bit interesting here. The way that the ICC is funded is it's funded purely by member states, and more specifically, it's based proportional to the size of the member state's economy. So countries with bigger economies would fund the ICC more. So the logic behind this argument would be the US, as one of the biggest economies in the world, if not the biggest, would therefore mean a disproportionate amount of funds. And you could impact this out to just anything the ICC does. So prosecutions for, I guess, mainly war crimes would be anything, but you can also have potential implication for structural violence arguments. So you can sort of implicate this whole new funding, new effectiveness of the ICC to structural violence. We'll get to all the questions at the end of all the arguments, but the second argument in favor of affirming would be U.S. accountability. This is also going to be a pretty generic argument, which is just to say that right now the U.S. is conducting a lot of bad behaviors, for example, trafficking. You could definitely find examples of other war crimes that the U.S. has been involved in. The link is also very simple. Acceding to the ICC would mean that we are now under their jurisdiction, and they can now prosecute us for whatever bad behaviors we're condoning, which would decrease whatever issue you want to make an argument about. And the impact will also be very straightforward. If you're impacting out to war crimes, it'll just be deaths from war crimes, etc. Nathan, can you click the? Okay, yeah, sure. So aside from US accountability, you can also make an argument about Russian accountability. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the conflict in Ukraine. The uniqueness evidence would just be Russia is committing war crimes or being very destructive in Ukraine. And the link would be right now, the ICC, remember, Putin is one of these individuals that the ICC has issued arrest warrants for and has indictments against, but actually hasn't actually done anything against, right? So the link here would be that the US joining gives the ICC leverage to actually like do stuff instead of just putting on paper that they're going to do stuff. And the impact here would be whatever you want to impact out to, like lives or I don't know, nuclear escalation if you're feeling fancy from Ukraine conflict. Cooperation allies, you can kind of think of this like multilateralism. It'll be right now, right, the US, and so far as we just elected Trump, probably not very well received among key allies, right? I think there's a lot of good uniqueness evidence that you could do about this, about how Trump would probably like cut us back significantly on that front. The link here would also be very simple. Joining the ICC shows that we're involved in international affairs. It bolsters cooperation, it increases multilateralism, etc. And the impact here would be just cooperation serving as a prerequisite to many issues. So if you guys debated maybe the surveillance border topic in September, in October, you would remember how sometimes people might make arguments about US-Mexico cooperation being important, or on the Taiwan topic about US-Chinese cooperation being really important. So similar to that, you can pretty much just pick like any country or the block of countries in which cooperation would be important.
All right, before neg arguments, do we have any questions about app arguments or the overview? I know we have some in the chat. Yeah, feel free to unmute and ask. I'll look at the ones in the chat right now. Tejas said someone's gonna run a K. Yeah, you can run a K on this, especially if you can link it to Africa arguments. A lot like
Structural violence. Structural violence, yes, to an extent. I mean, you do have like the sort of examples of war crimes or sort of genocide. Genocide would probably be a big one, but you can sort of implicate forms of structural violence in some of these arguments. So I wouldn't say it's the like most ideal topic to read structural violence on, but it's definitely like not a bad choice.
Mhm.
Um,
Nolan asks, does the US have to fund if they accede to the Rome Statute? Yes. So the ICC requires members to contribute to the court's budget depending on the size of their economy. Since the US is a large economy, they're gonna like fund a lot more.
yeah.
Next, Vihan.
Someone asked, what's the best arguments for lay judges?
Yeah.
There's not really a cookie cutter like sort of formula for that. I would say something that's really simple, easy to understand, and something else that lay judges tend to appreciate is when you have like really solid uniqueness evidence. So you want to find something where there's like a real problem to be solved or a problem that would be made worse by affirming, and then sort of explaining like using statistics or like empirical evidence, because those are other things that lay judges tend to buy into more, why affirming or negating would make that issue better or worse. So there's not really a cookie cutter formula. You just kind of have to decide that.
And Vihan asks, how long's the lecture? I'd say less than an hour usually. We'll be out of here before 3:30 CST, if that helps.
Um, how would the US joining allow the ICC to leverage Russia into doing so? Because when Russia joins, Putin gets prosecuted, so why they ever join? Yeah, so the US joining isn't saying that, oh, Russia is going to join as well because the US joined. It's sort of saying that when the US joins the ICC, independent of what Russia or Putin decides to do, it gives the ICC more sort of power. Not necessarily like hard power, but soft power, right? So let's say, for example, um, Putin decides, real example by the way, Putin decides to go to Mongolia. And Mongolia is a member of the ICC, but Mongolia doesn't arrest Putin. The
Or I
argument
think
there,
it's Malaysia, but yeah,
oh,
let's.
it's Malaysia, sorry. Um, so let's say Malaysia or Mongolia or whatever country it was. In that case, they don't arrest Putin, right? But let's say the argument that the AF would make is that, oh, the ICC is like gets the US on board. Then that means that these countries have more of an incentive to comply with the arrest warrant and indictment because they have the US behind them.
Yeah. Danush asks, anything besides ICC for Af, or does it have to include the ICC? Um, I think like this product this resolution is pretty like set on like ICC jurisdiction. I'd say like personally the only like way you could branch away from the ICC is that like another actor like some gains some form of power like using like something perceptually from the ICC, if that makes sense. So like um so like if like they, for example, right, like Alyssa talked about how like the US seems more accountable. So like if the US joins the ICC, people will look at us more positively. So like if you can say that the US gains this perceptual like advantage, then maybe like the US could independently like work on some other projects.
Yeah.
If that helps.
Uh, so someone asked, does the US really give that much incentive? Again, that's debatable, right? Obviously, the AF would want to say, yes, there's a lot of incentive, and the NEG would obviously want to say, no, there's a lot of incentive. So that's something that you just have to debate in round. Um, yeah, we'll talk more about funding as a potential NEG argument later. Does anyone else have any questions about the AF before we move on? All right. In that case, Nathan, take it away.
Yeah. All right. So on the neg, this one is mostly lay-centric. So the uniqueness is that the Constitution guarantees many things that the ICC does not, right? This is talking about the US Constitution. Many of the 10 amendments aren't upheld, or the Bill of Rights isn't upheld by the ICC. Joining the ICC means that technically we're giving up some of that sovereignty in order to allow the ICC to have jurisdiction. The impacts are like more narrative based in my opinion. So like you'd have to say that like if the US doesn't comply with the ICC because like we need to respect our constitutional rights, that may look the ICC look bad. Or like maybe domestically, especially with Trump's election recently, like the far right in the US is becoming like more and more polarized. Actually, like both sides in the US politics are becoming more and more polarized. So you can kind of like reference like the January uprising a couple years ago again, and be like, if we join the ICC, that'll make like people that respect the Constitution very angry. Maybe this might lead to like political uprisings or some form of instability. But I'd say this is more of like a perceptual like lay argument. Like even if you don't use it as a contention, just like at the top of case, being like judge, like joining the ICC is a fundamental violation of our Constitution. Like I think that's a pretty strong narrative to run. Right, on to some more substantive arguments. So first is American sovereignty. So you can say that US hedge is good and we're at a tipping point, or like we're recovering with like any form of conflict. So like Palestine right now, or like the Ukraine conflict. And the link is that joining the ICC means that we can't like conduct important military events or like exercise sovereignty because we're so restricted by the ICC. A literal example of like when we should have been like prosecuted by the ICC is when we like invaded Iraq for no reason. Like that would definitely have like caused a red flag with the ICC, but because we don't ratify, it means we don't face any consequences. If we do ratify, that means whenever we do something like that again, we do have to face consequences. And the impact is that again, like you want to frame up like the world in a very like US centric like perspective. So like it is good that we like bully countries and using soft power into like doing what we want, or like funding Israel, etc. All right, and then political prosecution. So this is kind of goes along with the lines of like weakening the US. So if you can find some uniqueness that the ICC is going to like go ham against the US, maybe because of Iraq, you can say that this is going to like greatly restrict our power. So like joining the ICC is going to like maybe lead to unfair prosecutions against like our ability to like conduct hegemony. And then you can like uniquely say that like for certain sectors of the world, maybe the Middle East right now, losing even a bit of power is really bad for like like international, like the scale of international politics. So again, like anything to do with hegemony, maybe if you can bring in like other powers like the Eastern Bloc, like China and Russia coming in and like tipping the scale, you can escalate it out into like nuclear war or something. All right. Someone in the chat asked about a funding trade-off, right? So this is that. So uniqueness, we're in like trillions of dollars of debt. That's true. We can't afford any more. And if we join the ICC, we have to fund them. So that means that if we like go into more national debt, that means something's going to be compromised. Supercharge that, considering that right now Trump just got elected, he's definitely going to start cutting something. Trump is definitely an America first president, helping other countries catch war criminals is something he frankly doesn't like care even a little bit about. Like that's definitely not something he's going to want to fund. And if fiat mandates that he does have to fund that, he's definitely going to cut something else. So whatever he ends up cutting is what you can impact out to. So like poverty or climate change, any like social services that he's about to cut domestically in the US can give you some domestic impacts. So honestly, if you're running this with a lay, I feel like that might be pretty good if you want to give them some more believable impacts. Right, Alyssa, you can take it from here.
Yeah, so as we discussed before, the ICC and like Africa, the African Union, are not the best of friends. So there's a few arguments that you can make on the neg surrounding that sort of difference. So one of these would be the African Union, as already established, is not the biggest fan of the ICC. And right now, China or Russia, whichever one you choose, is increasing their authoritarianism, sort of influence or hegemony in Africa. So the reason why joining would be bad because would like essentially the US joining the ICC makes the AU leave because it makes them feel just increasingly overpowered. It makes them feel really just not represented well. So they leave and they pull out of Western influence, and as a result, they turn more into Russian or Chinese influence, which would probably be can impact that out to things like great power conflicts or just authoritarianism, being bad in general. You can also just read generic US hedge good impacts. So, and then the other argument that we can kind of make about Africa is that, again, the AU, the African Union, does not like the ICC. We have a lot of instability in Africa right now, and there's really a few links you could take here. You could say that the US joining the ICC makes the AU leave or lash out, or that it incites aggressive ICC measures, which essentially is to say that it makes everything that's already complicated between the ICC and Africa just 10 times worse. And the impact to this would be that makes Africa unstable. And there's a lot of ways you can impact this out again. You could definitely make traditional structural violence arguments. Instability tends to affect marginalized groups the most. It does also lead to regional conflict or, again, great power conflicts that we've seen before. And then another argument on the neg here is going to be US diplomacy. So really, you can take a lot of routes with this, like a lot of these arguments. There's a lot of separate countries you can choose, right? But for example, let's say Israel, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia is at a tipping point with US relations, right? And one of these countries, oh, they don't like the ICC, right? Well, then the link here would be that the US joining the ICC, which they don't like, will sever relations with that party. And then the impact to that would just be whatever the impacts are to severing ties with that specific state. So, for example, severing ties with Israel could cause complications in the Hamas conflict. And now it's bad precedent. This one is more defensive than I would say offensive. And the reason is that it kind of just mitigates a lot of the AF's offense. So the uniqueness here would be the US rarely obeys international treaties it signs. You can also find precedent, I'm pretty sure, of the US just not signing a lot of other treaties. For example, we're not party to UNCLOS. And the link is that, oh, even if we do the affirmative, the US will probably just violate all these laws anyways, which will in turn weaken the credibility of the ICC because obviously having a major power come and sign on to the ICC only for that major power to just ignore all of it probably doesn't boost your credibility a lot. So the impact would just be any of the big four crimes that gets worse without ICC power. Those four crimes, as again mentioned before, are going to be genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression once they get through the negotiations on that. All right, that being said, does anyone have any more questions? I see a lot in the chat, so as you guys put those in, I'll just start from the top. Someone asked if the ICC can convict presidents or prime ministers. Yes, they can. What's really important to note here is that we actually see examples of this happening right now. For example, we see arrest warrants for Russian president. If you want to go back up to it, yeah, here Putin and also Netanyahu. So those are two examples where they definitely do have arrest warrants or just like grudges against big
Omar
leaders.
al-Bashir was also the president of Sudan. So
Yeah,
three big examples for you as well.
yeah.
I'll take the next one. Danush, for neg, can you run government contractors? Are you talking about like military contractors, like private contractors? Or like independent actors? Let's see. Like military? Yeah. Honestly, I'm not too sure about whether the ICC can like contract like war dogs. Um, my answer would be no, because I feel like they do have to cooperate with like each individual country. I think okay, so here's how I would link out to military contractors. It would be ICC extends jurisdiction to a certain country, like that's unstable. Let's like I don't know, Sudan, right? In Africa. And then Sudan, like you have to frame Sudan as being liable to like contract like military war dogs, right? Because as long as the ICC gives them like because the ICC has to cooperate with the domestic government can use whatever forces they want. So at that point, then I think you could bring in like military contractors. So I think it's possible. Does the ICC have representatives from domestic governments? Um, so two things. One, the ICC like cooperates with those representatives from the domestic governments. But two, if you mean like do they have people on the council or something, the member states of the Rome Statute elect judges and prosecutors from their domestic courts to the ICC. So kind of like how the UN works and the UN Security Council works, the ICC is basically like a puzzle of like the world's best adjudicators, quote unquote. So like everybody's judges like go up there. Another thing to point out is that like if the US joins, we're definitely gonna want to have a US judge on the ICC court. You can imagine how that would bring in biases against certain actors.
Someone asked earlier if the ICC can only prosecute people from countries that had ratified the ICC. No. So the ICC, uh, it itself issues arrest warrants for whoever the heck it investigates, right? So an example of this would be Putin. Russia is not a ratified member of the Rome Statute. They have not joined the ICC. But what we do see is we do see arrest warrants out for Putin as we speak right now. So the way that the ICC prosecutes people is it relies fully again on the cooperation of member states. So let's say Putin decides one day to come to America, and let's say, for argument's sake, that the US is now a member of the ICC. In that case, the US would be bound by the Rome Statute to go and arrest Putin. Now, will they actually do that? That's debatable. But the way that the ICC works is that it doesn't just rely on the countries that have ratified it, it also looks at the cooperation of member states to kind of get the point across. So, no, they can prosecute people from countries that haven't ratified the Rome Statute.
How come the AU? Yeah, Vihan asks, how come the AU doesn't just leave right now? Loki, that's a good question. They tried to pass it in
Probably
2017.
politics, I'd say.
Yeah, probably politics, because like the AU, like if you did the Somaliland topic, the AU, I think like 93% of the like the legislative like materials that like the AU like signs like doesn't actually become like instituted or like they all fail or something. Like the AU is a very like dysfunctional body. So if I had to guess, it's just like there's a lack of harmony um when it comes to their success. Also, I think that like enough countries in the AU still kind of want ICC protection. despite like thinking that they're biased. I think they more so like want the ICC to reform rather than to just like leave them wholeheartedly. So the argument you want to make on the neg is that like even though there can be like better mediation in the long term, now is a specific tipping point where they're very angry. And if you push them past the tipping point, that's where you cause a lot of escalation in Africa.
Yep. Danush asked if you can do institutional racism for Africa. Yeah, you definitely could. Again, the ICC is fairly prejudiced against Africa right now, just looking at like the statistics and the disproportionate amount of just like arrest warrants and indictments in tribunals. So yeah, you could definitely make an argument about that. Yeah, bad precedent could also be more of an overview, just looking at the chat.
Agreed. Chaos wants the slideshow, absolutely. We always put the link in the chat. Yeah.
Okay.
Will the recording be on YouTube? Yes, two places. One on, so I'm the Alabama branch director for outreach. If you look up Alabama outreach debate on YouTube, I already have the November and January topic lectures up there, and this one will be up there in like a couple hours. Also, this recording will also probably be on the outreach's official YouTube channel. I'll talk to Kaushik, the director, about it, and we can put it up there as well.
Okay, let's see. Do environmental crimes fall into one of the four things they go over: genocide, humanity, aggression? You could definitely make that argument. I see how you could probably spin it in forms of like crimes against humanity, like you're inevitably causing like humanity's downfall, or just like in short being like really like dismissive of environmental concerns. I will say though, I don't believe there's any precedent of the ICC going after anyone for like cutting down too many trees or anything. So you probably have to do like a bit of a link debate or like really look into that link if you want to make that argument. Um I don't think that right now they have an intent to expand their jurisdictions to environmental crimes just because everything that they've been focused on, like things like Putin and Netanyahu, still remain very focused on like military activities, war crimes, etc. Um, do they have the structure to convict companies? I would say more like the heads of companies. Honestly, all it does is just convict people or like try and like arrest people that have committed one of the four pillars of crime that they have jurisdiction over. So if that person is like the head of a company, then yeah, definitely. But they wouldn't just be like, "Oh, Apple, you suck. Let me convict you." Um Someone asked if you can run that if the US accedes, then the AU will leave feeling threatened, but it will redirect their funds to African problems and threats which has an impact of stability in Africa. I mean, I think you could. Obviously, there's a lot of arguments you can make on this topic. Then the logical oh yeah, I mean, you could definitely make that. You would also have to deal with the whole like loophole as Nathan talked about how the AU is just generally not a very effective actor, so you probably have to jump through a few hoops there, but
Yeah.
other than that, so
Also, another bit of analysis to do is that like, let's think about it, right? Like Putin, like if the ICC walks up to Putin and be like, Putin, the leader of Russia, we want to arrest you. Like, do you think he's gonna allow the Russian government to do that? No. Like, I think one of the reasons why the ICC is like, despite indicting so many African leaders, has a track record of failure is that you can't just walk up to like an authoritarian leader and ask them to hand themselves over to you. The only reason the ICC has been able to arrest some people is because of the rapid turnover in power that's very common among African secessionist states, right? So, for example, in like Sudan, for example, after the secession, there was a change in power allowing for like the former president to be arrested. So, you can run the argument that U.S. will be able to stabilize Africa. Personally, I think this topic is more that neg biased in saying that instability is the more likely scenario.
yep. Someone asked why would the US joining cause the AU to leave? Essentially, it's just like the US is a very big, powerful country. I think we can all agree on that. When the US joins the ICC, an institution that historically has disproportionately targeted African countries, when they see that institution becoming ever more powerful, that is what causes the AU to leave. But there is also a lot of sort of bright line debate you can make about this, right? For example, we've seen countries join year after year after year, right? Even if the US is a big country, why haven't the accumulation of countries joining up until now caused the AU to leave? So again, a lot of these arguments are debatable. Um,
Can the US sanction the ICC if they join the court? Uh, I think like formally no, but there's really nothing the US can't do, right?
yeah,
Like if we wanted to sanction the ICC, we could.
I
Uh,
mean, yeah,
I see very little reason why we would. I think the reason like we like haven't joined the ICC is because like we just don't want to deal with them like sanctioning us or like convicting one of our old presidents, for example, like Bush with like Vietnam or Afghanistan.
yeah.
Um yeah, like if they did try to convict us or something, the US would simply just like brush them off probably, and that fuels like the bad precedence argument.
Right. Is there a specific reason the ICC targets African countries, or is it just racism? Well, I don't think the ICC is made up just like entirely of like racist people, but I would say that the reason why the prosecutions are so disproportionate is simply because of like convenience, right? Think about it. It would probably be, from at least an international juror standpoint, easier to prosecute like smaller African countries than some like big great powers, right? For example, the US, or not the US, the ICC has historically stayed out of conflicts in Georgia where Russia is involved, or like places in the Middle East where the US has been involved. Well, not now, but before, right? So essentially, the ICC always has an incentive to just make things like efficient, and that's probably best done when they're going after African countries because it's just easier to prosecute. Um, there might be like a tiny element of racism in it. Obviously, I can't look into the ICC's minds and like tell you that. But yeah. uh, if the US doesn't join, then violence in Europe continues to increase. Um, but if it does join, it's a larger intimidation. What do you mean by intimidation?
I think he means that like it's a better deterrent, right? Like
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
forces the ICC.
So, yeah, that's definitely an argument to make. Um, Ukraine, for example, is part of the ICC. Um, and so are a lot of other European countries, right? So you can definitely make the argument that, oh, if the US joins this force that's going to prosecute them if they start committing war crimes, then they probably have a reason not to do so.
I do have to say though, like especially for larger actors like Putin, like the link evidence as to how you're going to arrest this guy has to be like very strong, right? Like Putin stepped foot into Malaysia and Malaysia was supposed to like arrest him, yet he's basically immune. Like you have to give like specific actors as to how like if the when the US joins, which of these actors will be ready to utilize their own domestic governments to enforce the tenets of the
Right.
ICC.
Right, because remember, the ICC in and of itself does not have a police force. They rely 100% on the cooperation of member states. So then the question then becomes, which member state is one, Putin going to visit, and two, which member state actually is going to arrest them? Because even if it's a big money player like the US, right? If Putin comes to the US, the question then becomes, is the US going to use their own resources and create a bunch of political controversy to arrest Putin? The answer to that is probably not. So you're obviously going to have a lot of like link debates if you do like try to read those arguments. Okay. So anything I didn't cover? Any last thoughts?
Climate change is Teo says is climate change structural violence against weak communities? Yeah,
Um, yeah,
you can always
although
yeah. Unless you
yeah, I will say when people think about structural violence, it is how should I phrase this? Let's say you do impact out to climate and you say, oh, that disproportionately harms minorities communities. Sure, that's true, but the response to that is by prioritizing climate first, you're inadvertently supporting like utilitarianism in the process. Because think about it, right? Climate change isn't something that like, oh, it just helps this group get ahead, right? Because it affects everyone. You're like people are already prioritizing climate change, right? So by doing that, you're sort of just like sustaining one of the pillars that already shapes our legislation. If you wanted to go the structural violence route, I would consider doing more things of like, or centering your arguments more about active targeting of minority communities or issues that plague just exclusively minority communities, because that is what's going to be more related to these sort of like Stufio arguments.
And however, if you still want to use climate change to link into structural violence, just say that the global south is always hit worse by SV, right?
Yeah.
Latin America, South Asia, they're always going to be hurt worse by SV. And that's usually where you see most like structural inequalities occur anyway.
The US joining improved NATO relations? Indirectly, possibly. I mean, NATO and the ICC are again two different things, but you could probably make an argument that a lot of NATO countries are in the ICC, therefore joining the ICC would mean more multilateralism on that front. Perhaps it would spill over. Like I said, this topic is very like there's a lot of broad categories that have a lot of subsections, so you can really just take any of these categories that we've already mentioned and kind of just delve into any specific countries or blocks of countries.
Danush asked, instead of SV, can we do extinction? I'd recommend that, especially on the tech. Most of these impacts are going to be existential anyway. Just run extinction.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
I have a question for y'all for administrative purposes. Is anybody not a part of outreach debate already? Like, did anyone like get invited by their friend that's not part of this nonprofit that decided to show up?
Just like you can raise your hands through the Zoom feature.
Okay, I'm gonna just assume all of y'all are already part of outreach. Okay,
Oh, oh, what one person?
Discord meeting link.
Oh, three
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so that means you're part of the Discord, yeah. So, um, if you guys like ever like want to like invite your friends to come that aren't part of outreach, they're always welcome to come. We're a nonprofit that tries to provide resources to everybody. So, oh wait, that's a lot of you. That's great. Yeah,
Great.
I'll put the Discord link for outreach as well in the chat, so
Oh,
you
it's
can
four. Okay.
join. And there's like a quadrillion other resources like mock debates and like free camps and stuff that we offer.
Yeah. All right. Any other
Yeah, Danush says arresting
arrest
people
people
developing
developing
bio.
bioweapons more into extinction? I mean, developing bioweapons in and of themselves isn't a crime. You'd have to prove that they're planning on doing something bad with those bioweapons, but sure. Oh wait, in that case, you'd have to prove that Germany is like using these bioweapons in a bad way.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't extensively research German
Wait,
bio manufacturing, but it would,
like actual people developing like, antibiotic resistant bacteria.
I
Um,
mean, it again depends on the purpose, right? Like if they're like in a university like doing a science experiment, then like ICC is not prosecuting them for that. It would again just
Like
depend on what they're doing.
no, like even if they're just doing it for a good purpose, like if one gets out or like if it like, a leak happens, it could like end humans. Or like it could be like really devastating because like we
I
can't
mean,
cure things that people
yeah, Danush, I think it's possible to run that argument is you just have to like warrant it very well, like very specifically. The Geneva Convention does ban biological weapons, or like the Geneva Protocol says you're not allowed to
of
like
development.
yeah,
Because
like
like people can just like, make weapons purposely, but they can also just do it as like a random science experiment, but it can still be like incredibly dangerous.
oh, wait. Okay. So I just looked it up for you. It says in the 1925 Geneva Protocol, it prohibits the use, but not the possession or development of chemical
Yeah.
or bioweapons. So
Yeah.
I think you would have to prove that they have an intent to use.
Right. Yeah.
Would I just have to say that the ICC would make this law, or
Well, you would have to prove that one, whoever's like making these bioweapons have an intent to use it, and it's not just to like experiment with like chemicals or whatever. You have to prove that they actually like have an intent of like going into war and like spraying like drugs massively on people.
you don't have to do that. It just has to leak, and then it's just like a regular virus. If it just leaks, like it's just gonna spread exponentially to different population groups
Yeah,
without
I
a
feel
cure.
like still though, like if the bacteria leaks, then like I guess the ICC like has the jurisdiction to
Yeah.
like German, the Chancellor of Germany or something. But
Then you also have to prove that the bacteria is gonna leak.
yeah, like until it leaks, I feel like you wouldn't have solvency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, then.
As of now, thank you everyone for coming. Those of you that aren't part of Outreach already, I really encourage you to use the slideshow as much as you want, and also join the Discord link I put in the chat. There's like 10 times the amount of resources that like we provided you here that you can have access to on Discord, and it's a really great and positive community. So yeah, thanks again everyone for coming, and we'll see you again hopefully at the March lecture.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Bye everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.